Hi friends, welcome to another video. Today we're going to talk about all the books that I read in the month of February, which for some kind of weird reason, even though it was shorter than January, I read more books in January, even though I already read a lot of books in January. Basically what I'm trying to say is I read 7 books in February. But for now, I read 7 books, so let's have a little chat about them. I came up with a little theme for this wrap-up because there were some books that are all kind of in the same vein. The theme for this wrap-up could very well be smutty books and the forces of nature. It kind of sounds like a YA title. Smutty books and the forces of nature sounds like a secret 8 adult Harry Potter book. Basically, what I mean with smutty books and the forces of nature is that I read a few adult romance books for the first time in my life, basically, and I want to talk about what I thought of those. And also I read a few books about nature, which sounds really boring, but it was actually really cool, and I'm going to talk about those as well. But first I want to talk about the 3 other books that I also read that don't fall into this category, but don't worry, fear not. For these 3 books I will also talk about how smutty they are and how much force of nature is in there. So let's just get started. So the first other book that I read this month was Daisy Jones and the Six. Let me just scoot over a little bit. I read this one on audiobook, and this is the book that convinced me that listening to fiction on audio is really great. This book is that 70s vibe, rock and roll kind of story about a band called The Six and another artist called Daisy Jones and their lives and how they eventually end up forming a band together. This book is written in a documentary style. All the characters kind of come into frame and kind of talk a little bit about like, oh yeah, I remember when that happened, and then the other character comes forward and it's like, yeah, I have this and this to say about that. That's the format of this book, which works really well in an audiobook because every character has its own cast member. If you like the 70s, if you like rock and roll, this is so much fun. Oh, I had a good time. I have to admit, after like halfway into the book, that initial excitement kind of wore off and I was like, okay, kind of get it. They're getting drunk again. They're sniffing some you know what again, and they're having sex with all their groupies again. Okay, so that's like the only reason that I didn't give this book 5 stars, but it does deserve all the praise it gets. I've never read a book that's so good at showing the different dynamics between the characters. I loved to see the dynamic between like the front man and the background band. So is this book smutty? No, it's not at all. There is a lot of romance. This book is so angsty. With the romance, it's kind of ridiculous, but it's really well done. It's not angst in the way of like, oh, I'm in love with this boy and this other boy and I don't know which one to choose. Nor it's angst in like, I can't spoil, but it's angst in a way that's like legitimate. This is tearing me apart. I just really want these characters to be happy. How is anything gonna be good ever again type of angst. Is there any force of nature in there? There are a lot of natural substances, if you know what I mean. Moving on. The next book that I read is a poetry collection, and that was Death Republic by Ilya Kaminsky. All the poems of this poetry collection together form a story that is about a small town that is like occupied by the military, and at one point a deaf boy is shot, and from that moment on all the characters in this town kind of become deaf as well. It's more like symbolic magical realism, and you read about their experiences. I made a whole video about my experience reading this book because it was the first time ever that I tried poetry. I had a hard time. If you want to see me struggle and read some of the poems to you, you can go watch that video. The poems in this book have no meter and no rhyme, so that's pretty difficult and confusing as a beginner to poetry, but I did actually end up really enjoying it. I did really like how this book portrayed the emotions of living under military scrutiny. The theme of this book, according to me, was kind of like the solidarity between the citizens and how they kind of work together to live under these weird circumstances. Turns out I was kind of wrong about that interpretation. Again, if you want to know more, you can go and watch that video. But of course, the most important question, was this smutty? A poetry book? Well, actually, there were kind of some weird lines in there. The main character of this book is sometimes like talking about his wife, about her, how she holds her breasts, and he's like looking at her when she's showering. It's a little weird. Are there any forces of nature in this book? I mean, this book really is about humanity. And then the last book that I read that is not yet in the category of smutty books and forces of nature is a book that I just finished, and that is A Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo, aka the super anticipated new Leigh Bardugo book that I finally read. Difficult to summarize this book, but basically it's a story that takes place in Yale. There are secret societies that have magical abilities, and our main character Alex is... Ooh, that was my phone. Our main character Alex is part of the Ninth House, which is kind of monitoring all the other magical houses to make sure that they don't do anything weird, but then someone is murdered and we're trying to figure out what's going on. This book is very dark. You have to know that. There are a lot of content warnings for this book, so I highly recommend you look up some of the content warnings if you think you need that. Also, you don't have to read any of other Leigh Bardugo's books in order to read this one. It's completely a separate thing from the Grishaverse. This is a very divisive book. Some people DNF'd it, some people really didn't care, and other people seem to really love this. I'm on the camp of I really love this, but I'm very aware that is mostly because of the concept, because I like anything that takes place in like university, murder mysteries, dark stories with a fantasy element added into it. It's as if this book was like written specifically for me, and because I love the concept so much, I was able to kind of gloss over the fact that it's pretty slow and very confusing. You know, when you're watching a movie and you're consistently asking, what is going on? Who is that? Who is this person? What's happening? And the other people that you're watching with are like, dude, chill, like just watch the movie and it'll all make sense eventually. That's kind of what I had with this book. If you're confused the first 100 pages, that's okay. We all are. You just have to keep reading and it will all make sense eventually. I will say that the plot of this book was definitely the weakest part. It kind of feels all over the place, and I think that's because there's just a lot going on in the story. There's so many mysteries. We have the mystery of Alex's background and what happened in her past. We have the mystery of the disappearance of another character. We have the mystery of a murder that happened like in history, and then we also have the mystery of the murder of a girl at Yale that just happened. And then on top of that, we also have the magical elements and all the secret societies and whatever the heck is going on with that. So there's a lot. I loved the characters in this book. Our main character Alex is quite something. Very feisty, very anti-hero. Our other main character, Darlington, who is what a darling. He is Alex's mentor and I think potential love interest. And we also kind of get to see his story, and he's my baby. That's what I can say. So was this book smutty? No, but there were like some short random scenes that were suddenly like slightly smutty. They felt tonally out of place, but maybe that's just because I'm very used to reading YA fantasy, and this is one of the first adult fantasies that I've read, so maybe this is normal for adult fantasy. I don't know, but there were a few descriptions of genitals that kind of took me by surprise, to say the least. Is there any force of nature in this book? Well, there are a lot of organs and blood and bodies, so... Then we're moving on to the actual smutty books and the forces of nature. So let's first talk about the smutty books. I was wanting to read some like adult romance books because I was just really in the mood for like a fluffy romantic story, and I thought, you know, I always read YA, why not try an adult romance novel? I read 2 Goodreads Choice Awards winners for romance. One is The Hating Game and the other one was The Kiss Quotient. What I've learned is that I tend to enjoy heavy romance more in the setting of a genre fiction and not when it's just about romance. But then again, I only read 2, so maybe that changes. The first one that I read was The Hating Game by Sally Thorne. Yes, that's the one. This is an office romance, a hate to love romance, obviously, as you can tell by the name. It's about 2 colleagues who work in the same publishing house, and they have a very strong rivalry going on. They really hate each other, but we all know that hate is very close to love. This was fun. I gave it 3 stars because it was just a lot of good fun. I would recommend it if you're just in for like a nice romantic read. But one of my biggest problems with this book is that the hating stopped way too early on into the story. You know, if I sign up for a hate to love romance, I want there to be hate for like the majority of the story, but that really wasn't the case. But I still really enjoyed this book because I think what this book did very well was create very interesting characters. Sally Thorne was really good at continuously using the plot and using things that are happening in situations to drive the characters apart from each other and creating that will they, won't they constantly to really kind of keep you on your toes, and that was super well done. This book did a really great job at also bringing in some like elements of the characters' lives and not having everything be about the romance. And then the other book, The Kiss Quotient by Helen Hoang, disappointed me a little bit more. So this book is about a girl who is autistic and she basically has a hard time with like relationships and all those things. So she hires an escort to kind of teach her how to make love and have a loving relationship. This book is also own voices, so that really made it so that the representation is very well done. The love interest is Vietnamese, so more representation. Basically, the thing with this book is there's just too much lovemaking. Basically, just from the beginning of the book, it just keeps going all the way to the end. They just all the time. And I was just like, okay, that gets boring real quick. Like the writing is way too fast-paced, as in things happen in this book so fast, continuously, that it doesn't feel like we get any time to really make it feel plausible or get any emotional connection to it. It felt like everything that was happening in this book was happening because the author said so, you know, without it being actually natural. The way people talk feels very unnatural, as if they're just trying to further the plot instead of talking like real humans. And because of that, still the writing, the sexy scenes also were just very robotic in a way. They use the word milk for something that I never ever want to see described as milk ever again. This book is supposed to be fake dating because, you know, the whole escort hiring thing, but it doesn't feel like fake dating. It feels like you're just reading 2 people having a relationship, and then sometimes they have a small bit of inner monologue that's like, oh, but it's not real. They behave as if they're into each other. They have a fake relationship as if it's an actual relationship. It didn't feel like a fake relationship at all. It feels like I was just reading a book of 2 people who were already in a relationship with each other. So romance-wise, this book completely failed for me. The thing with this book is that the characters' personal stories from the main character and the love interest were way more interesting than the romance. You know, where the hating game was really good at weaving the characters' personal lives and their romance together and creating them in such a way that their personal lives continuously influenced their romance and drove them apart and kept kind of the hate-love thing going. In The Kiss Quotient, it was just their personal lives were interesting, but the romance had absolutely no build-up. There was too much smut. There were too many smutty things happening constantly, to the point that it genuinely just got really boring. So I gave The Kiss Quotient 2 stars, mostly just because of the well-done representation and characters. Alright, and then The Forces of Nature. Let's talk about some books about the world around us. Don't leave, it's cool, okay? I promise you, these are really cool books. I really like these. So the first book about nature is just a wonderful book, and that was The Hidden Life of Trees by Peter Wohlleben. He is a German, I don't really know what he is, but he's a guy that knows a lot about trees. Basically, wrote a book about trees. Yeah, you heard that right. I read a book about trees, and it was amazing. So wonderful to actually learn facts about how nature works. And there are so many really cool things, like for example how trees in a forest are like a huge network, and when one tree is dying, the other trees help that dying tree and give them nutrition to keep it alive. He talks a little bit about the wood wide web, which you may have heard of. It's this huge web of fungi in the roots of the trees that connects all the trees in the forest, and learned that trees communicate with each other using kind of like scents. So for example, when giraffes start eating the acacia trees kind of signal to the other trees in the forest to create kind of like nasty substances to ward off the giraffes that are coming their way. It's so cool. You're watching this and you're like, dude, what the heck is this girl being like excited about freaking trees? That's so boring. If you're like that, read this book and you'll realize that trees are pretty cool. The only thing that I didn't really like about this book is it uses a lot of language that you would normally use for humans, like pain, screaming, talking, hearing. I'm not quite sure if it's like a stylistic choice or just a way to kind of convince us like, look, the trees are really much like humans. He also is often talking about how the trees feel pain, but he never actually explains how that works, because do trees feel pain? I don't know. I would like to learn about that, but he just mentions it and never explains it. So again, I'm not sure if that's just a stylistic word choice or if trees actually feel pain. But he was very quick to draw the conclusion that trees are very much like humans in ways that didn't really convince me. But overall, I really enjoyed this book. I gave it 4 stars, and I would highly recommend it to anyone who enjoys nature, even just one bit. And the second book on nature is a Dutch book, but I still kind of shortly want to talk about it because I think it's pretty important, and that is roughly translated How Will We Explain It by Jelmer Mommers. This is a book about climate change, basically. I almost didn't read this book because I thought, you know, I know things about climate change, I don't need to read this book, which is a very weird sentiment that I had, but I think maybe a lot of people have that. I'm still really glad that I read this book because I still learned a lot. It's not a book that goes very deep into the subject, it remains rather surface level and just kind of tells you all the general things, but even then, I realized that there were quite a lot of things that I didn't know yet. For example, I didn't know the acidification of the sea was a result of climate change. I also didn't know that the melting of sea ice on the North Pole does not influence the rising sea levels. It's actually the melting of land ice that influences this. This really is a book about the growing rift between nature and humanity, and how us humans have kind of resorted to seeing nature as something separate, as something that we need to study, something that we need to explain, but something that we're definitely not a part of ourselves. And he makes a great case for saying how that is a mindset that is not really helping us with today's problems, and I really appreciated that. So if you happen to be Dutch, I highly recommend reading this book. If you're not Dutch, I highly recommend just reading any book on climate change. I know that it's kind of scary, and I know that it's a subject most people like to avoid because they don't really want to think about it too much, but that's exactly the reason why you really should be reading some books about it. And those were all the books that I read. Let me know your favorite book of the month of February, and let me know how smutty or how much force of nature was in there. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you soon in another one. Goodbye!